It was March of 845, and an enormous Viking fleet was sailing up the Seine River toward Paris. They had already sacked the abbey at Rouen, and the Frankish king, who ruled over this territory, was very anxious that they not be able to do the same to the royal-sponsored abbey of Saint-Denis, which lay in their path. The Vikings were led by a man called Ragnar, very likely Ragnar Lodbrok, the character that the TV series Vikings was based on. Now, in order to intercept the Vikings, the Frankish king sent an army, which he divided into two parts, one for either side of the river. The Vikings managed to defeat one of the divisions of the Frankish army, and they took over 100 men prisoner. And then they did something ghastly. They hung more than 100 Franks on a small island in the middle of the Seine. They did this in part as an offering to the Norse god Odin, and in part as a method of psychological warfare for the remaining Frankish army. The Frankish army was unsuccessful in stopping this Viking fleet. They reached Paris and they sacked it. In fact, they caused so much damage that they were bought off with more than 5,000 pounds of gold and silver that was handed over to them by the Frankish king Charles, who ruled this territory. And he got that money by raising a special levy on his subjects. The Vikings had already discovered that this part of the Frankish kingdom, Western Francia, was a much easier target than the lands that lay closer to home for them. This particular Viking fleet had sailed out of Denmark, and if you look at Denmark on a map, it's very close to what is now modern Germany, and that was also under Frankish control. Germany was a lot closer to the Danes, these particular Vikings, than France. So why were they in Paris? Well, that's because Germany, the land we now call Germany, was at the time Eastern Francia, and it was ruled by a very different kind of king. His name was Louis the German. At least that's what historians have dubbed him, although to his contemporaries he was probably called Ludwig. We're going to call him Louis the German because that's how he shows up in the history books. But he was a Frankish king who was also known as Louis the Iron Hand to his contemporaries, and that's because he had such an extraordinary level of physical strength that he was known for bending swords in half. He ruled over the eastern part of the Frankish Empire, and he was the grandson of Charlemagne. There is a wonderful story which really encapsulates the character of Louis the German, and it's told by a source from the period called Notker the Stammerer. And it goes like this. Louis the German was sitting on his throne, receiving a delegation of Danes who had come to pay tribute money to him. And he was sitting on his throne in full battle armor, which was his habit. Louis wasn't a fan of rich robes and golden crowns, so he sat there in battle dress. And when the Danish ambassadors approached, they had a chest of golden coins, which they put down in front of the king. And Louis demanded that the coins be strewn on the ground and trampled underfoot. This was a formal way of showing his disdain for cash. He showed more interest, however, in the weapons that the Danes had brought, and he picked up one of the swords that was part of the tribute offering. And in front of everybody, sitting on his throne, he used his hands to bend the blade of the sword until it snapped. At which point, he looked at the sword in disgust, and he looked at the Danish envoys with something very similar. And hurriedly, the Dane, who had offered this tribute, carefully took out his own sword, offering it to the king. At which point Louis took this sword, examined its tensile ability, bending it and then slowly allowing it to return to its normal configuration, and he was satisfied with this. Notker the Stammerer reports that the Danes looked at each other and said, "Would that our kings disdained gold so much and valued iron so highly." It wasn't just the Danish envoys who thought Louis the German was fearsome. The Vikings attacked his territory in 845, the same year they were attacking Paris. But Louis the German and his Saxon army defeated them so resoundingly that they wouldn't return for another 30 years. Instead, the Vikings looked for softer targets, and they continued to find them in the lands of Louis's half-brother, Charles, who ruled the western part of the Frankish kingdom. This is only one of many such stories about Louis, or Ludwig the German. Perhaps more than any other figure, he embodied the Frankish warrior ideal, and in his lifetime managed to carve out a kingdom that was able to resist Viking attacks from the outside and family treachery from the inside. You are listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is episode 2 in Kingdom of the Franks about Louis the German. Now, before we get into today's story, I need to pause and say a special thank you to the people who make this podcast possible. And these are a group of people who support the podcast on Patreon. I want to say a special word of thanks to people who are supporting the podcast at the highest level, and these include Richard Hubner, Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Rick Kane, and Gordon Carl. As a Patreon supporter, you get access to additional content around the making of these episodes and private conversations, both online and live, which happen at regular intervals after the release of each new podcast. So if you're interested in more, head on over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and become a member of the Villains and Virgins podcast community. I love it when people and events that I've heard about separately suddenly come together in reading that I'm doing. It's sort of like two huge puzzle pieces that suddenly connect, and you begin to see a much larger picture than you did before. And I had this experience while doing the research for this episode. I realized that Louis the German lived in the 800s, which is also the same time that the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage begins some hundreds of miles away in Spain. And Louis the German is part of the same medieval world. He venerates relics. He has a piece of the true cross that he holds as part of his official regalia. He's interested in saints' shrines. And so the idea of going on a pilgrimage wouldn't have been foreign to him, and in his lifetime he sees what will become one of the major pilgrimages in the Christian world begin. Side note, I just got back from doing part of the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage, and the history of that pilgrimage and its place in the medieval world in general is going to be the subject of my next podcast episode. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The other piece that connected here were the Vikings. So we've all heard about the Vikings. They've been the subject of a very popular TV series. People are interested in their gear and the places that they attacked, and we sort of look at Viking activity as this separate category. But the Vikings are just one player in the world of Louis the German. In fact, they're right next door. And what's interesting about them is that they are referred to in several different ways by Frankish historical sources. For example, sometimes they're called the Danes, sometimes they're called the Norsemen, and sometimes they're called the Vikings. Now, these are Frankish sources, so they're worried about the Vikings that are right next door. And again, Denmark and Germany are basically neighbors. So to make it easy, when these people are at home, they're referred to as Danes. When they go out in longboats to raid and pillage, they're more commonly referred to as Vikings. But they're the same group of people in these Frankish sources. For example, we see this Ragnar, the same guy who raided Paris, returning home to Denmark to report to the Danish king the results of his raid in Paris. So the Danes, the Vikings, the Northmen, in these Frankish sources, they're the same people. It might be more useful to think about the term Viking as a job description. I mean, these guys might have been farmers or artisans or landowners at home, but when they got into their ships and they left their home waters and started going to foreign places to rob, then they were called Vikings. So it's important to keep this in mind as we talk about Danes and Vikings in this particular story, because to the Franks in East Francia, they were the same people, essentially. In our last episode, we saw a Shakespearean level of family drama unfolding in the family of Louis the German. So just to reorient you on the main players and how we got here. The Frankish emperor, a guy called Louis the Pious, but we're just going to call him the emperor, has 3 sons. The oldest is Lothair, the second is Pippin, and the third is Louis the German. Then he decides to have a 4th son. When his first wife dies, he gets a new wife. He adds a 4th son. This guy is Charles. Now, the emperor had decided to break from Frankish tradition in a fairly catastrophic way. Frankish tradition was that the king would parcel out his land into roughly equal chunks and assign one to each son. But this emperor decided he was going to favor the oldest son, Lothair, give him the title of emperor and a much larger share of land than his brothers. Unsurprisingly, this caused a lot of resentment amongst the Pippin and Louis the German, the younger 2 brothers. And then when the 4th brother Charles came along, and everything had to be redrawn again to assign a portion of land to Charles, well, things only got worse. So in our last episode, we saw all kinds of uprisings and betrayals and rebellions, including the emperor himself being imprisoned by his oldest son Lothair, along with the youngest son Charles. Lothair takes both of them prisoner and deposes his father. And who rides to the rescue? Louis the German. So we see that Louis the German rescues his father and his baby half-brother Charles, who's kind of a teenager at this point. And the balance of power is continuously in flux, and it doesn't stay stable, because even though Louis the German does this, his father, the emperor, flips his position again, and after punishing the oldest son Lothair for this rebellion and taking the throne away from his father, then decides to put Lothair back in position as the favored oldest son, the co-emperor with the largest amount of land, and the one in charge of being the guardian of young Charles. So when we left at the end of our last episode, Louis the German was extremely disgruntled and feeling like he'd gotten a very poor return for the risks he had run and the loyalty he demonstrated to his father. But of course, the drama doesn't end there. The following year, in 839, the emperor's 2nd son, Pippin, died. But Pippin himself had 2 sons, one of whom is now called Pippin II, or Pippin the Younger, and these 2 sons of Pippin expect to inherit their father's lands. But the emperor has no interest in these grandsons and their claim, so he redraws the empire yet again, ignoring their claim and basically partitioning it between Lothair and Charles. This forces Louis the German into an uprising. It's not just because he's angry, it's because several of his nobles now have land that's been reallocated to his older brother Lothair. And unless Louis does something to reclaim that land, he's going to lose these nobles. They can't have loyalties to 2 different brothers. It's against the law. So Louis is actually forced into some kind of military uprising to try and reclaim his lands, and his aging father, the emperor, has to ride out and try and suppress this. It's all very messy. When we reflect on the choices that were made by the emperor, Louis's father, it seems hard to think of a worse set of decisions that he could have made. And it seems that every time he made one decision where people could kind of come to terms with this being the new reality, he flip-flopped and changed it again, and just causing continuous chaos throughout his lifetime. And that chaos wasn't going to go away even when the emperor himself expired. So the emperor dies in 840, leaving the Frankish Empire well seated to produce a civil war. And that is exactly what happens. So while Louis the German might have been astonished at his sudden fall from grace after rescuing his father, he couldn't have been much surprised at what happened immediately after his father's death. It was fairly predictable. Lothair, the oldest brother, despite the promises he made to the emperor, despite the vows he took to protect his half-brother Charles, immediately seized the throne and said, I should be the emperor of all of the Frankish territory. I'm in control. And he then launches an army on his brother, Louis the German. So Lothair sends his eastern army under one of his best generals, and their mission is to contain Louis the German in his kingdom of Bavaria, keep him there. Lothair had originally intended to seize more of the territory that Louis the German regarded as his, but Louis had an army ready to go, and his determination to take the field and fight his brother's army actually caused Lothair to pause. And so he leaves an eastern army there on the border under this general, and he tells his younger brother, Louis the German, I'll be back next year. We'll fight this out. In the meantime, I have other things to do. And off he rides to what he considers to be an easier target. That's right, the territory of his youngest half-brother, Charles. So Lothair goes to attack Charles. He leaves this large army under the control of one of his generals with the mission of keeping Louis the German in his own territory of Bavaria. While this is happening, Louis the German receives a desperate message from young Charles. Please help me. Lothair's coming with an army. He's going to take my land. God knows what he's going to do to me, etc. And Louis knows that if he stays put and allows this to happen to Charles, Lothair will finish up doing whatever he wants to over there and then come back and take care of Louis. So it's a desperate situation, and Louis is motivated by, surely, his own strategies for survival, as well as a sense of loyalty, perhaps, to his younger brother. So he has a problem. The army that Lothair has left is really very large. And if he takes to the field to fight them directly, his odds aren't great. So he comes up with a cunning plan. Louis marches his armies north, away from the flat plains where he would have been expected to take on Lothair's army. And he's going north because he knows that there's an asteroid crater that divides a mountain range. And this crater is so deep that it's now become a drainage point. All the water running off the mountains is now falling into this depressed territory in streams and draining into the Warnitz River. So Louis knows that if he can lure his brother's army in there, they're going to be occupied with multiple river crossings, and this is going to make them vulnerable. So Louis goes ahead, leading his army into this crater area and concealing them, and he waits for his brother's army, under that deputy general, to follow him. And sure enough, they do, and as they're in the bottom of the crater crossing these rivers, Louis takes them by surprise. He leads his troops down onto his brother's army and decimates them. He even kills the general in charge. He's essentially destroyed Lothair's eastern army and broken himself and his troops out of their containment in Bavaria. This is a devastating defeat for Lothair's side, and it also enables Louis and his army now to ride to the defense of his youngest brother Charles. It was a daring, high-risk strategy, but Louis pulled it off with the kind of battlefield savvy that is going to become his signature. The civil war that was now underway in 840 would involve Franks killing Franks in massive numbers. Lothair, the oldest, allied himself with the sons of his dead brother Pippin, Pippin the Younger, and so forth, promising them land in exchange for their help. Louis the German, obviously, was riding to defend Charles. So we have these two sides, all of them intimately connected, fighting for control of Frankish territory. So this is bad for everybody. First of all, the Franks are their own best enemies. So all of their tactics, all of their skills are also possessed by their brethren on the opposite sides. So them killing each other is extremely messy, it's extremely bloody. It also creates opportunities for other people. So the Slavs, for example, who are border peoples in the territory of Louis the German, are fully aware that he and his army are very busy with their hands full fighting their Frankish brothers. So this is an opportunity for the Slavs to expand their territories, consolidate their power, and become more of a threat. It's also an opportunity for the Vikings and others in the area who are well informed about Frankish politics and know that this is their opportunity. So it's bad for everybody. Inside the Frankish Empire, peasant farmers also see it as a chance to organize uprisings and try to loosen the economic constraints that keep them busy working to support the empire. They too know that their feudal lords are very busy killing each other, and so this is perhaps an opportunity for them to change their own circumstances. The Frankish Civil War was brought to an end by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. And many historians regard this agreement as sort of the birth certificate of modern France and Germany. As I mentioned in our last episode, both the French and the Germans regard the Franks as their founding people. And so this is sort of the moment when we see a division into what will become France and what will become Germany. Charles, the youngest, gets Aquitaine and a lot of the other territories that are going to be the foundation of modern France. Lothair, the oldest brother, gets the central chunk of Frankish territory, which includes Burgundy, which will eventually become part of France, as well as territories in Italy. And Louis the German gets the eastern part of the Frankish Empire: Bavaria, Swabia, Thuringia, Saxony, and a lot of the territory that's going to become the heartland of modern Germany. The Treaty of Verdun is regarded as kind of an armistice among the brothers. They all know that it's a very tenuous peace that could be overturned at any time, but they also recognize that the Civil War is disastrous, and each of them needs to take their energies away from fighting each other and go back to deal with problems in their home territories, or the sections of the Frankish Empire that are theirs. And for Louis the German, this means the Slavs and the Vikings. Now, Louis the German never inherited any of the jewels or royal regalia of his grandfather Charlemagne. Those had been given to his two brothers, Lothair and Charles, on the emperor's deathbed, because the emperor at that time was pretty angry at Louis the German, who was leading an uprising. So he was out of favor at that moment, and as a result, he didn't get any of this regalia. In a certain sense, this left him free to define his own image of kingship, to decide which symbols were going to be indicative of who he was and what kind of a kingdom he was building. And Louis takes a very different path from his brothers in this respect. In fact, throughout his career, he stays away from jewels, gold, and fine clothing. So Louis the German inherits this piece of the true cross, and he puts it inside a larger, ornate, sort of liturgical cross-shaped object, which he keeps next to him when he's sitting on the throne in his official capacity. Now, the cross had been associated with imperial victory since the Emperor Constantine had first adopted it centuries before. And even though the Western Roman Empire had long since collapsed, the cross was still used by the eastern half of the Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantines, and they carried it into battle. So it's perhaps not surprising that the Christianized Franks, who saw themselves as the inheritors of the Western Roman Empire, would also adopt the cross as part of their formal regalia. They may even have been deliberately mirroring what they saw the Eastern Roman Empire still doing. And now, in the 800s, the terms imperator and Caesar were being used to refer to Louis as the ruler of his domains. So again, you can see a really clear line of connection that these Frankish kings saw themselves as inheritors of the Western Roman Empire. But while there's a sense that they're looking backwards toward the glories of Rome, they're also very much at the beginning of this medieval idea of knighthood, which is something that the Romans wouldn't have recognized. So just like the Romans, the knight was a warrior who possessed physical strength and skill with weapons. But there were a couple of additional features that made the idea of a knight a different type of fighter. First of all, he had to have a war horse. You couldn't be a knight without a horse. And the ability to have a war horse implied a certain level of wealth. In fact, you had to be a member of a noble family to be a knight. So that is a key component of this particular type of warrior. But the third aspect is a Christian identity. The knight was supposed to be a devotee of Christianity. He was supposed to show reverence toward the cross, toward relics of the saints. He was supposed to be devout. And this Christianity was supposed to limit and discipline some of the behavior that mounted men on horses with sharp swords might otherwise engage in. Now, of course, I don't intend to suggest that knights in the 9th century and onwards always abided by these elevated moral standards and refrained from things like rape and pillaging. In fact, pillaging was extremely common. I'm only suggesting that there's now an ideal that they're supposed to aspire to and measure themselves against, which the Romans wouldn't have recognized. In the person of Louis the German and his noble knights, we can see both of these traditions coexisting, sometimes uneasily. There are aspects of them that look distinctly Christian, but there are other things that they're doing which are simply about imperial dominance and control. For example, the law of the Bavarians states that a king is fit to govern so long as he could, quote, exercise jurisdiction, march with the army, judge the people, leap upon his horse, and carry arms effectively, unquote. So this principle says you're not fit to rule us unless you remain an effective fighter yourself, personally, physically. At the point at which you're unable to lead an army into battle and fight there effectively yourself, you shouldn't be king anymore. Now, I need to point out that this is a Bavarian idea. So Bavaria being part of Louis the German's territory in East Francia. It's one of the things that makes them quite different from Frankish ideas in other parts of the Frankish Empire. This is something that is distinctly Louis the German and his people, and it's going to define how Louis will behave throughout his lifetime. These are the standards that he holds himself to, because if he fails, he's going to be seen as unfit to rule by the Bavarian nobles he most depends on. In Louis's official portraiture, in his coinage and so on, we see him portraying himself with a thick head of hair and a prominent drooping mustache, which were seen as signs of virility. He uses these on coinage and royal seals. This is the public face and the self-representation that he wants to have. He wanted to portray himself as a Frankish warrior first, and only secondly as a king. Almost certainly he inherited some sort of crown in his youth from his father the emperor as a sub-king of Bavaria, but he almost never wore it, preferring instead to appear always in battle dress. He preferred iron to gold and jewels, and in this self-representation, he was sending a message to his nobles and his subjects. I am a ruler who has won my right to rule by force of arms on the battlefield, not because I inherited a throne and regalia from somebody else. Because if he'd simply relied on his inheritance, Louis the German would have ruled an increasingly tiny domain, and we would probably not have heard about him except as a footnote. So we see Louis the German borrowing titles from a couple of important precedents. He's echoing his grandfather, who wears the title of emperor, not just king. And we can see Louis being referred to as an emperor of the Franks. Never mind, it was just the Eastern Franks, but he uses imperator or emperor, and he's echoing his grandfather as well as the Western Romans. The two pieces of regalia that Louis did carry on formal occasions included his sword, the real one, not an ornamental version, and a staff, which did have some ornamental gold and silver engraving on the top, but was nonetheless a functional club. Now, Louis's own definition of leadership was something that he expected his nobles to share, and he was known for calling them out if they deviated from this standard. Frankish knights in his court imitated Louis's behavior and standards of dress, and one of them reminded Louis's son of this sometime later. He said, quote, "Your most devout father," meaning Louis the German, imitated Charlemagne's example, not once, but throughout his entire life, so that no one who was seen worthy of his attention and teaching would dare to wear anything while on campaign against the enemy except armor and woolen clothes with linen. And if someone of inferior discipline, ignorant of that custom, had anything made of silk, gold, or silver on him, and by chance met Louis, he departed after having been made wiser, after being rebuked and corrected by Louis's words. He would have said, quote, "Just look at you, overloaded in gold, silver, and scarlet. You miserable wretch! Isn't it alone enough for you that you might meet your doom in battle and perish? Why must you also give into the hands of the enemy for the adornment of their pagan idols those possessions with which your soul might be ransomed?" Unquote. So what you can see here in this report is that Louis expected everyone to dress plainly, and the idea of trying to distinguish yourself with expensive clothing was almost a dishonorable thing to do. Louis is saying that the honor of fighting and dying in battle should be enough for you. You don't need to wear regalia to indicate your status to other people. Your status will be proved in action on the battlefield. And if you should die, any of the expensive property and clothing you leave behind should be at home so that we can donate it to the monastery to say prayers for your soul, not something that can be taken as booty by the opposing army. Now, this insistence on plain warrior dress comes from something more than just simple austerity. It was actually a shrewd political move, because one of the risks of a Frankish army going on campaign was fighting amongst the Frankish nobles. All of them had this idea of their own glory and status and dignitas. And so there was a risk that they would start getting into competitions about who was more significant or honorable or higher ranking than whom. And the infighting amongst these nobles, as they were in close quarters on campaign, could threaten the effectiveness of the army itself. And this wasn't theoretical, it had happened. So by insisting that his nobles get rid of the fancy gear, Louis is prohibiting them from demonstrating visually their status and beginning this sort of one-upsmanship in terms of wealth or family. He wants them to be distinguished only by their actions. And so while this austerity becomes a signature part of his brand, it's not just austerity for the sake of austerity. There's very good reasoning behind it. Now, Louis cultivated a close relationship with his nobles, on whose support he depended in order to maintain his authority and the borders of his kingdom. And so he developed an inner circle of these nobles, which he called the king's friends. These men were bound to the king personally by oaths of fidelity and friendship, and they were also part of an inner circle where they were expected to engage in social activities with the king on a regular basis, things like hunting and giving feasts and attending mass together. So it wasn't just a formal feudal oath of loyalty that these guys were taking, which of course all the nobles had to take. But this inner circle were supposed to be closer to the king by personal bonds, bonds of direct friendship and relationship. Now, obviously, this was a very desirable circle to be in, and the king's friends were often rewarded with some of the most important posts. They were called magnates, and they were often in charge of border security in some of the most unstable or critical regions. So it was very important that these men were very loyal to Louis, because he was going to put them in places where their loyalty and effectiveness would be absolutely necessary for the security of his kingdom. Many of them were given key posts on the borders with hostile pagan tribes like the Danes and the Slavs. And there were always intrigues, nobles who were aspiring to get into this circle and sometimes plotting and trying to find ways in. There were always more people who wanted these key posts than there were key posts to hand out. And this dynamic, in some ways, drove the expansion of Louis's empire, because there were always people who wanted to have one of these positions. And If you have too few positions, what do? Well, you take some more territory, and therefore you've just created new positions and borders that need to be defended, new posts for important friends of the king to occupy. Now, I was talking about the effectiveness of Louis the German in building his empire, and I think that the Vikings are an important example of this. So as I mentioned at the beginning, in 845, the Vikings not only attack Paris, which is part of his brother Charles's domain, but a different party of Vikings attacks part of Louis's territory, which is, of course, much closer to their homelands. So Louis's Saxon nobles effectively repel the Viking raiders. They kill a great number of them, and the ones who survive are compelled to jump onto their ships and paddle away as quickly as they can. On their way out, they do a quick stop and smash and grab in the city of Hamburg, which is still part of Louis's domain. Louis then sends a diplomatic mission to the king of the Danes, a guy named Horik. Remember, when these guys are at home, they're called Danes. When they get into their raiding ships, they're Vikings, okay? So Louis is angry about Viking incursions in his territory, and he goes right to their boss, the Danish king, Horik. And he says, I expect you to pay me reparations for this raid on Hamburg and other parts of my territory. I want you to return the captives you've taken. I want you to return the valuable possessions that you've stolen. And not only are you going to return these things to me, but you are going to pay me tribute from now on as your feudal overlord. Or else. And guess what? The king of the Danes, Horik, does as he's told. So from that point onwards, we don't see a lot of Danish or Viking incursion into Louis's territory. And in order to maintain this relationship with the Danes/Vikings, Louis undertakes some other politics to ensure that the Danish king Horik keeps his end of the bargain. I should point out here that these Vikings in Frankish sources are not all the Vikings there were. We're talking just about the Vikings that came from Denmark. And of course, there were Vikings that emerged from other places as well. So just to make sure that we're limiting our discussion to the ones strictly that came from Denmark, who were right on the border of East Francia. So the contrast is striking because in Western Francia, the Vikings are being paid to go away by Louis's half-brother Charles. But in East Francia, the Vikings, their king, the Danish king, is paying tribute money to Louis and returning the stuff that they took. So the contrast between these two Frankish brothers and which one was more effective in terms of repelling the Vikings couldn't be more stark. So I mentioned that Louis undertook some political maneuvers as well to ensure that Horik and the Danes/Vikings kept up their end of the deal. So one of the things Louis did was to shelter a guy who's referred to as a Viking king in a number of the sources, a guy called Harald Klak. And so he had actually been ejected from Denmark through rivalry with other more powerful Viking or Danish warriors. And he came to Louis looking for military support in getting his land and position back. Harold lives in Louis's court for quite some time. Louis shelters him, makes agreeable noises, and actually tells Harald Klak that it would be better if he and his retinue converted to Christianity, because politically it would be easier to justify the Christian Franks riding to the defense or the support of another Christian ruler rather than the Christian Franks riding to reinstate a pagan Norseman. So we can see here that religion is an important indicator of being part of Louis's inner circle, and in fact he uses it in his official ceremonies. He requires his nobles, when they take their feudal oath, to swear it on a fragment of the true cross, which we've already mentioned he had in his possession, whereas subject peoples who weren't Christian, such as the Slavs, would take their oaths on their swords. So you want to imagine that these examples of overlordship are public. Louis the German will fairly regularly be sitting on his throne in his armor, and he'll be receiving tribute payments or oaths of alliances from border peoples. And he'll take that tribute money that, for example, the Danes or the Slavs might bring, and he'll publicly redistribute it amongst his loyal nobles. So these episodes give the nobles a chance to witness the dominance of their leader, as well as to be personally financially rewarded for their contributions to maintaining that dominance. Now, unfortunately, Louis's son, who is remembered by history as Charles the Fat, had none of his father's austerity or effectiveness. In fact, he was compelled to pay tribute to a Viking king called Gottfried, and in 882, a source called the Annals of Fulda reports that the Frankish army, quote, was greatly saddened at this, and regretted that such a prince had come to rule over them, one who favored the enemy and had snatched victory over the enemy away from them. They returned to their homes greatly shamed, unquote. So Louis's reputation is so significant because throughout his lifetime, he remained extremely effective at asserting the dominance of Frankish power over border peoples and maintaining tribute coming into the Franks, as opposed to the Franks paying tribute outwards to anybody else. Now, of course, all of this required discipline. And with all of these ambitious, warlike Frankish nobles under him, you have to know that at times things got out of hand. Behavior was perhaps not what was required by knightly standards. And so how Louis was going to deal with this would be another mark of his signature as a leader. And he enforced standards of behavior quite harshly. So there's a story about one of his knights, a guy called Albgis, who runs off with the wife of another important man, basically carries her off, sleeps with her, runs away. And when Louis finds out about this, of course, this is a violation of Christian principles and of the behavior that's expected of knights. And quite apart from religion, if he hadn't done something about this, you would have had feuding and warfare in between your noble families. It would have been a disaster. So Louis punishes Albgis quite harshly. He says, first of all, you lose your warrior belt. So this was the symbol of manhood and of status as a Frankish warrior that a boy received in a formal ceremony when he became a man, usually about the age of 15. That's when Louis got his. So he strips Albgis of this very important object and says, no more, you don't get that. Furthermore, you're going to live 3 years celibate, away from your wife, no sex for you, and you're going to be on a very Spartan diet of basically bread and olives and not much else. No meat for you either. Furthermore, you're going to live in exile. So this punishment is horrifying to other Franks, the idea of being stripped of your warrior status, prohibited from having sex, and basically living the life of a monk. Nobody wanted that. So it was very effective in ensuring that other nobles kept themselves in line. There was another type of punishment that is referred to in the sources as harmskara. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it properly. This is an old word, but it basically translates as punishment in the presence of the army. A group of nobles received this punishment when they ignored a messenger from Louis, and so they're forced to perform this dishonorable and humiliating punishment. Basically, the nobles had ignored the instructions of the king's legate or messenger and had caused damage to the lands of a monastery that was paying Louis tribute money. So if a monastery is paying tribute to Louis, it means they're under his protection. And his authority depends on his ability to protect institutions and peoples that are paying him this tribute money. So it's very important that when the monastery is attacked and their lands are damaged, that Louis does something about it. So the harmskara, or punishment assigned to these nobles, was to ride their horses to a designated city, dismount, take the saddles off their horses, place the saddles on their own backs, and then walk home carrying their saddles. Now, this might sound fairly minor, but it was actually quite a significant punishment, because when Louis issues this directive, he's governing from the city called Regensburg. And the city that he sends his men to ride out to is Rothenburg, which is approximately 191 kilometers or 118 miles away. So the guys had to ride out this distance and then walk the whole way back carrying their saddles. So the men have basically been humiliated by taking the place of their horses. Instead of being mounted warriors on a horse, the horses are gone and the men are wearing the saddles on their backs as though they were themselves horses. They're walking in the biting cold of an early March in Bavaria for multiple days, and they're doing this in the sight of everybody. So peasants working in the fields, monks moving about in the back gardens of their monasteries who see them passing on the road, women, everybody sees these guys who are being forced to perform this humiliating action. So when they finally get back, they're very cold, very exhausted, and very ashamed. It was a highly effective punishment. Now, high standards of discipline weren't just a matter for Louis himself and for his nobles. They applied also to the members of his family. Now, you might recall from episode 1 that Louis the German had been married at the age of 17 to a woman called Emma, and his father, the emperor, had arranged it. Emma was the younger sister of Louis's stepmother, the emperor's second wife. It was very complicated. But even though the emperor was dead and his wife was no longer a power player in Frankish politics, Louis is still married to essentially his aunt by marriage. Anyway, she's the only wife that Louis ever has. She's the mother of all of his children. During the course of their marriage, they produce several sons and daughters. And Louis and his family are quite pious. Louis himself is known for doing things like walking barefoot behind the cross in procession, regularly attending Mass, studying the scriptures, and reading commentaries on the scriptures that are in his personal library. And we can assume that similar levels of devotion were felt by his wife. Now, we know this because she takes a vow, but to explain that, let me back up. Carolingian churchmen, or Frankish churchmen at this time, taught that sex was permissible only when you were married, it was permissible only with your spouse, and it was permissible only when you needed to produce a child. In other words, if you didn't need to produce any children, or you were no longer able to produce any children, you had no business having sex. Now, this was what they said. Surely there were many couples who blithely ignored this particular pronouncement and carried on having sex even when they were no longer of an age to produce children. But the Frankish churchmen didn't make this up. They got it directly from St. Augustine, who basically says exactly this in his Confessions, and says that married people, husbands and wives, should abstain from having sex except when it's absolutely necessary, and the less you did it, the better, really. So the idea of intercourse just for pleasure, just for bonding, just for happiness, did not exist in church theology at this time. So when Louis's wife Emma is no longer of childbearing age, there's evidence that she takes some kind of vow of chastity. And we have this idea because she begins to use terms to refer to herself, terms like shining and virtuous, which in the parlance of the time have the connotation of chastity or celibacy. And so when she begins to refer to herself in these ways, and using other symbols and language, she's signaling to other people that she's aspiring to the highest level of holiness, which at this time is celibacy. And this is why priests and monks and nuns were regarded as having a different status from other people, that celibacy and chastity is a key part of that. So Emma, in her 40s, when she's no longer able to produce children, embraces this status. So if his wife Emma is taking this vow of chastity, what does Louis think of all this? Well, no one asked him directly and wrote it down, so we can't be 100% sure, but we have some indications. First of all, Louis didn't have any illegitimate children that we know of. And it would be pretty hard to have an illegitimate child as the king of East Francia and not have people know about it. There were other Frankish kings who had illegitimate children, and inevitably, especially if they were sons, they became power players in the wars of inheritance. So Louis doesn't produce any children outside his marriage. and this is the 800s we're talking about, if you have a mistress, preventing her from getting pregnant wasn't something that they were particularly skilled at. So we can infer that Louis probably didn't have any kind of regular sexual contact outside of his marriage, or perhaps any at all. Which I think goes a long way to explaining why he had a reputation for bending swords with his bare hands and being angry enough to get the Vikings frightened enough to pay him tribute money. Don't you think? Now, Louis wasn't above using celibacy for political purposes either. In fact, he had 3 daughters, and he commits them all to the church as nuns. In fact, he puts them in key positions in charge of nunneries or abbeys so that they're in these sort of high-ranking organizing roles, but he commits them to lives of celibacy. Now, why would he do this? Well, there were actually excellent political reasons for it. First of all, it looked good. It looked like Louis and his family were exemplars of Christian moral standards. His wife publicly having made this vow of chastity and referring to herself as, shining and virtuous, and his daughters all prominently involved in church positions. But there was another motive at least as powerful, and it was this. By committing his 3 daughters to the church and chastity, Louis removes his daughters as potential marriage partners for ambitious Frankish nobles. Guys who might think that by marrying into the royal family, they, or their children, could inherit Louis's throne. So in a certain sense, by committing his daughters to the church, Louis is effectively eliminating threats to the security of his throne and whoever he decides to leave it to. What did Louis's daughters think of this enforced celibacy? Well, we have some statements by the oldest one which seem to be positive. What the younger 2 thought of it, we may never know. So here we have a king and his family who are looking very religious. But the curious thing about politics in the Eastern Frankish Empire is that church officials also looked very military. So abbots and bishops, these church officials, were also important players in the politics of the Frankish court. First of all, they were landowners. If you were going to have a monastery or an abbey and have a chunk of land, you needed to hold that land in a position of loyalty to the king. So just like knights, barons, and magnates, abbots and bishops were feudal landholders who were required to swear oaths of allegiance to the king in order to hold their land in trust from him. But these guys who became abbots and bishops in East Francia were often from the same noble families who produced magnates and knights. So the same pool of people. And furthermore, Louis required every single monastery to pay him every year 2 spears, 2 shields, and 2 war horses. So they weren't immune from contributing to the war material. And they didn't just do this by handing over these objects. We actually have accounts of East Frankish bishops riding into battle on horses with swords, leading men to fight. Could you imagine your local church being required to hand over a couple of M4 carbines and an Abrams tank every year to the state? Or could you imagine your local priest heading into battle along with the troops wearing a uniform? These are the parallels we're talking about here, and we actually have written accounts of bishops in Louis's territory riding into battle against the Vikings. Although they didn't do that until the 880s, after Louis dies, because the Vikings didn't become a problem again until he was no longer their king. But there's this culture of militarism that pervades all levels of society, and churchmen are no exception. This, by the way, is different from how churchmen were behaving in Western Francia. This is a distinctly East Francia culture that develops under Louis, and it's not representative of all the Franks. That's why Louis has this very interesting position vis-a-vis the Vikings and others. It's because he's doing things a little bit differently. So the economic foundation of this Eastern Frankish Empire rested on labor, specifically the labor of slaves and people like them. Now the word slave sounds an awful lot like the word Slav, doesn't it? and that is not an accident. The Eastern Franks had moved away from using more Roman words like servus or mancipium for servants toward using the term slavus, which sounds a lot like Slav. Who were the Slavs? The term Slav refers to people from Eastern and Central Europe primarily, speaking Slavic languages. The people who Louis the German and the East Franks would be referring to would be people like Poles, Czechs, and Slovaks. The population of laborers in East Francia was divided into slaves and the dependent or impoverished free laborers. Many of the subjugated border peoples, such as the Slavs, were often required to provide free labor as a condition of remaining where they were. And so this type of a rule transformed them from Slavs into slaves. And there are various types of labor on large properties in East Francia. Estates could be directly farmed using slave labor, but they could also be parceled out amongst peasants who paid rent money or services in exchange for residing on that land. What's the difference between a serf and a slave? It's pretty muddy. In this case, the term serf seems to refer to a person who's tied to a particular piece of land and whose services basically transfer to whoever owns that estate. Whereas a slave wasn't necessarily tied to a particular estate necessarily. And we can see what we would call serf labor or free peasant labor occurring on the same estate where there are also slaves. For example, the estate of Lauterbach in Bavaria in 821. It's described as having 11 landholdings, one of which was occupied by a free smith, this means a blacksmith, and his unfree wife and children. So why was he free and she and the children not free? This comes from an old Roman law that the East Franks had carried on, which basically stated that if a woman was unfree, then that status transferred to any children she might have, but not to her husband. This estate was also the home of 37 landless slaves. Together, they made up 40% of the total estate population, and the other holdings were occupied by one or two families and their slaves. The case of this smith is likely explained by the fact that there were slaves working in his parcel under his direction. So you had kind of an ironsmithing or blacksmith factory of sorts under his direction. So labor is complicated. There are people who begin as free laborers who might eventually become indebted or impoverished and end up as serfs. And there are people who might have been free on a border who then find themselves supplying slave labor to Frankish nobles in various places. Unsurprisingly, Frankish nobles were very much against any kind of labor organization or alliance or agreement, and Frankish churchmen preached continuously that laborers had a duty to serve their masters. This church position is hardly surprising when you remember that Frankish churchmen were also land-holding nobles. They came from the same families, and even if their position was bishop or abbot, they too relied on labor to make their lands profitable. So they're very much part of a system that is supported by the labor of peasants and slaves. Louis the German and his younger half-brother Charles, who is remembered by history as Charles the Bald, have a rivalry that will last the rest of their lives. You remember that they were allies during the Frankish Civil War that ended with the Treaty of Verdun in 843. But this led to a very sort of uneasy peace, and they were forever jockeying for an advantage in Frankish politics from that point onwards. Charles the Bald seems to have been a character who was happy to say whatever seemed expedient to him at the time, and then turn around and do whatever else he felt like when the opportunity presented itself. For example, when the oldest brother Lothair died, he left a son. We're going to call him Lothair the Younger, and that son inherited Lothar's part of the Frankish kingdom. Now, Louis the German and Charles the Bald, who were the uncles of this young man, agreed that if Lothair the Younger should die childless, that they would divide his portion of the empire between themselves. So they make this agreement. Now, when Lothair the Younger does indeed die, and he dies without offspring, Charles the Bald swoops in really quickly and grabs that territory for himself. He didn't care about the agreement he'd made with his older brother, Louis. Now, Louis actually had to invade that territory the following year by force to take the part of it that was originally agreed to be his. Now, another point of contention was who would inherit the title of Holy Roman Emperor, the title that Charlemagne had, and that Louis the German's father had had, and that Lothair, the oldest brother, had fought so hard for. When Lothair died, his son, Lothair the Younger, had been given this title, so he was crowned Emperor Louis II. But he made an arrangement with his uncle Louis the German, which was that when he, Louis II, died, Louis the German's oldest son would inherit the title of emperor. But once again, as soon as his nephew, Louis II, the emperor, died, good old Charles the Bald did an end run around that arrangement that had been made with Louis the German, and he sneakily gets the Pope to crown him, Charles the Bald, emperor instead. As you might recall, the Pope has always been absolutely necessary in putting this particular title, or this crown of Holy Roman Emperor, onto the head of a Frankish king. So by appealing to the Pope directly, Charles the Bald effectively negated any arrangements that had been made inside the Frankish royal family for who was going to step up and take that position next. So Charles the Bald is really an opportunist. He's a guy who's not afraid to play dirty and say whatever he has to say, and then seize opportunities when he sees them, regardless of what he's said. And I guess in this way, he's following a family tradition, because Lothar did exactly the same thing. And Charles the Bald, in all of his other manners of rule, couldn't be more different from his older half-brother, Louis the German. Charles the Bald is very much a fan of rich robes and gold and royal regalia. And perhaps this wasn't surprising, because he was the youngest of the four sons, and so maybe he felt he needed all of this gold and finery to underscore his legitimacy as ruler, especially when he finally gets the title of Emperor of all the Franks, Holy Roman Emperor. He actually leans on Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire traditions, lots and lots of gold, when he becomes Holy Roman Emperor. And the contrast with Louis the German couldn't be more stark. For Louis and his nobles, the legitimacy of rule was based on battlefield effectiveness. And Louis wears this in his garments and his demeanor his entire life. He has no time for gold, no time for jewels. He walks around in battle dress with a sword, and it wasn't just for show. Louis the German was on campaign pretty much every single year of his reign. And he was a king from the time he was 15 until the age of 70. So that's a very long time to be occupying this position and to be defending it. The armor and the sword weren't just for show, they were regularly used throughout his reign. By contrast, Charles the Bald was sometimes criticized even by his contemporaries for being, quote, as timid as a hare, and preferring to buy off the Vikings by taking wealth from his subjects and handing it over to them, rather than repelling them with battlefield victories, in the manner of his brother. And Louis stayed every inch a warrior and an incredibly tough guy right up until his last year of life. One of my favorite stories about him occurs when he's 70, which is the year he actually dies. And what happens is he's standing inside a villa or a house, and part of the upper floor collapses. It collapses on top of him. And so the bystanders are horrified, thinking that, oh my God, the king has just been killed. He's buried under this rubble. So they rush over and start removing the pieces of detritus. And Louis the German stands up and he says, I am unharmed. And he walks away. But he was not unharmed. Actually, he'd cracked 2 ribs. And this, as you may know, is an incredibly painful injury. But Louis wasn't going to be stopped by this. In fact, he got on his horse the next day to ride off to meet Charles the Bald, his brother, as had been previously scheduled. And people reported, the men who rode with him on that journey the next day reported that they could hear the cracking and grinding of his ribs as he was riding his horse, but that Louis the German did not betray by so much as a wince or a groan, let alone a complaint, the immense amount of pain he must have been in. Now, I have a doctor friend who raises an eyebrow at this story and thinks that it's highly unlikely that anyone who had cracked ribs would be able to undertake riding in that condition. Is it possible that people exaggerated the extent of Louis's injuries in this story? Of course it's possible. But even if they did, telling a story like this indicates what was important to the Eastern Franks and to Louis himself. They prioritized physical effectiveness and the ability of their leader to actually function on a horse in pain as a criteria for leadership. And Louis the German knew this, which is why, even if he was injured, no matter what the extent of those injuries might be, he would feel it was incredibly important that he be seen to ride his horse and to be physically capable the next day. So regardless of the actual extent of his injuries, a story like this is very interesting because it tells us what the priorities of Louis and the Eastern Franks really were. Louis the German dies at about the age of 70 on August 28th in 876. He had lived like a warrior his entire life. This was how he had represented himself in public as well as in private. And when he died, this was how he was buried, in an unadorned soldier's outfit with armor and the spurs on his boots. His brother, Charles the Bald, died shortly afterwards at a much younger age. He was in his 50s. This signals the end of an era. The emperor's sons, all of them, are now dead, and who is going to inherit the empire that they have built and fought over? A most unlikely candidate. It was, in fact, one of Louis the German's sons, and surprisingly, the youngest of the 3, the one who's remembered by history as Charles the Fat, and who is described by his contemporaries as Charles the Excessively Mild, a young man who lacked all of his father's austerity and under whose rule the Eastern Frankish Empire dramatically weakened. The Vikings once again attacked, and the Franks themselves were shamefully forced to pay tribute to a Viking king. Charles the Fat was eventually overthrown by another Frankish king, someone who came from the same family, who was called Arnulf of Carinthia, a man who had already proven himself an effective warrior and a magnate patrolling the borders of the Eastern Frankish kingdom. When Louis the German died, he decided to follow the traditional Frankish custom, not the disastrous policy of his father, and divide his kingdom up into 3 roughly equal chunks. He could not have known that only one of his 3 sons would survive and end up holding all of that territory. And if he'd had to place a bet on which one it would be, he probably wouldn't have put his money on Charles the Fat. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on Louis the German and the Frankish Empire. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss the next podcast episode coming very soon, which is an extension of this world. It's about the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage, medieval Christianity, and pilgrimage traditions. You can also ensure that more episodes like this are created by supporting this podcast on Patreon. If you head over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and become a paid supporter of the community, you'll have access to bonus content and live conversations regularly scheduled after each one of these episodes is released. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next episode.